Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS. Good morning to friends in the United States. Good morning to friends in Europe. Good afternoon, rather, to friends in Europe, and good evening to our intrepid followers in Tokyo. Delighted to have you with us for this live webinar on advancing data governance in the G7. We are just thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with some people who are working on this important topic of data governance, who I will introduce in a moment. But essentially, we have been following in the CSIS Economics Program this important issue of data, which, as everyone knows, is everywhere, in everything. But there are very few global, if really no global rules on the access to, control of, flow of data. There are emerging rules and norms in various parts of the world, but there is not a kind of an accepted global standard or approach to this important topic. And so we have been very interested, like others, in this set of developments. And today's focus, which is the end of a project we've been doing with some private expert roundtables to look at what the possible areas of agreement might be among a critical group of countries, the so-called group of 7 advanced industrial democracies, market democracies, who are meet annually, or at least they usually meet annually at the leaders level and then through the year at official level, to work on a broad range of issues in the global economy and the global commons. This is well, we're soon going to be turning the corner into the UK host year. They will be hosting the G7 forum in 2021. And one of the topics that they will be looking at, among many others, is data governance. So we are very interested to see how this story is going to unfold over the next year. I should note, we also have a speaker from the Japanese government, and Japan was the country that introduced this idea of a global conversation about data governance when former Prime Minister Abe at the Davos Summit last January, January 2019, time is sort of, and we're in a time warp here, but it was 2019, introduced the notion of data governance as a topic for that year, the year that Japan was hosting the G20 Summit. And ultimately, G20 leaders agreed on the concept of data free flow with trust as an organizing principle for data governance. So this is a kind of continuation of that set of efforts. So we're delighted to have a representative who I will introduce in a second of the Japanese government. After I let each of the panelists give introductory remarks, we will then have a short conversation among the 4 of us, and then I will allow you, the audience, to ask questions. In fact, I'm already going to invite you through the Q&A function here or on your screen. There should be a button that allows you to ask a question. Feel free to start doing that now or as our speakers present, and I will try to take as many of those questions as I can before we end promptly at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time or 2:30 p.m. GMT. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist, who is the Deputy Director in the Cabinet Office for G7 and G20 policy in the United Kingdom, Ewen Philpott. Ewen has been working on these issues for some time. She's a very experienced member of the G7 sort of management group. around the world. And she has been in government for longer than that, working at the Department of Health in the UK, including coordinating the UK's leadership of international antimicrobial resistance work. So she's got a lot of experience, including on things that are going to be obviously relevant to a G7 summit in 2021. So with that, let me turn the floor to Ewen.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues on the line. Great to be speaking with all of you, and just a shame that I can't see all of your lovely faces. Never going to quite get used to this strange virtual world. So thank you, Matthew, thank you, CSIS, and thank you, Japanese colleagues, for suggesting this conversation. It's an incredibly important conversation to be having, and really glad to be doing this with a US-based think tank like CSIS, given we're obviously picking up the presidency of the G7 from our US colleagues. And we're obviously at an incredibly interesting point in time in the transition between these administrations. So a great group of people to be having this conversation with. So I've been asked to speak briefly on how the G7 can contribute to this exam question about shaping the future of global data governance. And I won't pretend to be an expert, a technical expert in this area. In that regard, I'm very much here to listen and learn from my fellow speakers and from all of you. But as Matthew alluded to, I have worked on several multi-dimensional international issues for UK Prime Ministers, current and old, such as antimicrobial resistance, modern slavery, tackling terrorist use of the internet. And two things that I've learned through that when tackling these like really complex multi-dimensional issues is that firstly, you need to have exactly this kind of open, trusting collaboration between government, private sector, third sector, so that we're coming at this from all angles, and we're acknowledging our mutual need of one another to solve a problem like this. And secondly, that you build a critical mass of countries that believe in the same goal and are all pulling in the same direction. And I hope that the G7 will be able to help with both of those things, continuing to facilitate multi-sectoral conversations like this and building that critical mass of countries pulling in the same direction. So I'll first start with a brief overview of our proposed G7 policy agenda. I will say that it's still relatively early days, and with these things, it's always important to remain flexible, but I will set out today what for the UK our ambitions are for our presidency next year. And then I'll go into giving a little bit more detail about our intentions in the space of data governance and technology. So overall, we have three kind of headline objectives for our presidency year. Firstly, that we show that the G7 is united, that we're a consensus body that is united by the values that brought us together in the first place of transparency, democracy, human rights, but also recognizing our role within a wider international system. The G7 does not act in isolation, and in fact, it would be much less effective if it did. We have to work hand in glove with our G20 counterparts, with our UN counterparts, and all 193 countries around the world. Secondly, we want to show that the G7 can really take concrete steps on the biggest global challenges around the world. So we'll be trying to make concrete progress on areas like climate change, health, data tech, trade, and prosperity issues. And thirdly, recognizing that actually for all of us, we're in an incredibly challenging context domestically at the moment, and the G7 needs to show that it can improve the day-to-day life experience of our population. So sharing experiences amongst the G7 about how we can support and improve outcomes for our populations at this incredibly difficult time as we try and build back better. So those are our headline objectives. And then we have 4 policy buckets that will be trying to drive forward across a suite of 7 different ministerial tracks, all leading up to a leaders summit that will meet next summer. So we're using a bit of an organizing principle around building back better, building back stronger, that you'll hear me use. This is just our own kind of organizing principle. So firstly, building back stronger. Our first priority at the moment has to be health. We're going to be looking at how we can be improving the response to the current crisis, making sure the G7 is working together to make vaccines available and accessible at affordable prices around the world, that the manufacturing and distribution systems are in place, but that also we start to look forward to how we can bottle what has been great about the collaboration in health throughout this pandemic, and things that we wish we had in place should we face one of these things again. So working very closely with the WHO and with the G20, responding to the outcomes of the IPPR review that will come out next summer, thinking about how we can better use data actually to have better horizon scanning and risk awareness using human health data, animal health data, environmental data to better predict such pandemics. And thinking about how we can make sure we have an armory of pandemic tools available sooner next time: vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and antimicrobials. And I'm not just saying that because I'm an evangelist for AMR. So that's our first bucket, building back stronger, a whole suite of health objectives. Secondly, building back greener. As many of you will know, the UK has the presidency of COP26 as well as the G7 next year, which we're incredibly honoured to hold jointly with our Italian colleagues. And it just so happens that they also have the G20 presidency next year. So both the G7 and G20 will be really important staging posts working towards COP26 next year. It's a big moment where we need to really raise ambition for climate policy around the world. So the G7 will be a staging post on that. We would love to see a net zero G7. We would love to see really meaningful contributions on climate finance. And we would love to see collective investment in green technologies that are going to support that transition, as well as a whole suite of commitments around protecting biodiversity loss and nature around the world. Third bucket, building back better, the whole suite of economic issues and making sure the G7 is on the forefront of future frontiers, such as technology, such as data, such as space governance. It's also where we'll be talking about trade and reforming the multilateral trading system. It's also where we'll be talking about economic resilience amongst the G7 and how we can make sure our open market economy model is still resilient to future shocks. And lastly, building back together. There'll be a whole suite of work that we want to drive forward with partners outside of the G7, with developing country partners, with emerging country partners, to defend democracy, to support media freedom, to support religious freedom around the world, as well as a whole development agenda to make sure we're supporting developing country partners to recover through COVID, to strengthen their own health systems, to work with the important multilateral development banks to make sure people get the assistance they need. And a really important agenda close to my heart, of course, on gender equality, supporting girls' education, supporting women's economic empowerment, and tackling violence against women and girls around the world. So that's our kind of overall 4 buckets: building back stronger on health, building back greener on climate, building back better on the economy and tech, and building back together around democracy, development, and gender. But to say a little bit more about our technology ambitions, we will have a digital and technology ministers meeting in the spring, probably meeting virtually, making the most of these kind of platforms. And that will be where we want to have the kind of technical discussion about what we as the G7 can do to break off a piece of the puzzle of this really complex environment, to see what G7 can do as a group of like-minded countries to create a critical mass, as I was saying, pulling in the same direction, to show that new approaches to digital governance can be agreed, that we can agree sets of principles politically to shape the future ecosystem of future tech, of data governance, etc. But alongside that, we want to have a wider conversation. So we'll be looking to set up a future tech forum later in the year, potentially in the autumn, working really closely with OECD colleagues, who it's great to see on the line today. And that will be the place where we show that we want to have this more multi-sectoral conversation about how we strive for interoperability, how we reduce barriers to cooperation, how we build on great examples like the Global Partnership for AI to take this conversation forward, how we show how open societies can be built and maintained in a digital age, importantly maintaining trust through transparency and accountability. And thirdly, showing how data and digital can help solve the biggest global challenges that we're addressing across the rest of our agenda: health, climate, trade, etc. So we'll be creating these structures of a Sherpa track leading up to leaders, a ministerial track that will try and break down some of the pieces of the puzzle of what the G7 can do specifically, and then trying to have this wider conversation with the Future Tech Forum, which crucially will bring in industry. It's so important that industry and government are talking about these things together to make sure that that political level conversation can be translated into the technical and the delivery aspects that will really make these things real. So that's my kind of whistle-stop tour of our plans for the UK's G7 presidency. As I said, I'm here to listen and learn from all of you here today. But one thing I will say is we're really keen that this is a positive agenda next year. I think so often issues of digital and data are talked about as scary and difficult. And yes, there will be challenges, but I think it's really important that we see the opportunities here. And I know that my Prime Minister is certainly keen to make this a positive agenda, showing that there is more that unites us than divides us when coming to tackle these really important issues. Thank you, Matthew.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ewen. A really terrific overview, and really the first, I think, presentation of the UK's vision or approach to the G7 next year that at least we've had in Washington. So really very helpful to a wider audience as well here. Thank you for that. I know there will be questions. I already have a couple myself. So thanks for that. Now let me turn to Shikata-san. Noriyuki Shikata is Assistant Minister and Director General in the Economic Affairs Bureau at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. Shikata-san and I have crossed paths many times over a number of years, back when he was director of the economics section of the North American, that is the difficult issue of dealing with the United States on trade issues and so forth. He was also political minister in the UK, and we overlap briefly there. He spent a grueling year, the last year, assigned to Harvard University, working on research there. So, but delighted to see him in his new role, where he's very centrally working Japan's efforts on the G7 and the G20, among many other things that he does as Director General. So with that, let me turn to Shikata-san, and thank you again for joining us so late at night, Shikata-san.
Well, thank you very much for your very kind invitation to this very important seminar. We are very much excited, to hear UK's expression of leadership in its preparation for G7 next year. So I wish to just touch upon the Japanese perspective on data governance. So as was introduced by Matt, the former Prime Minister Abe presented, this idea of data free flow with trust at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in January last year. And this is an idea that enhances free flow of data while ensuring, trust of consumers and companies regarding data privacy and security. Of course, when we hosted Osaka G20 Summit last year in June, based on this concept of DFFT, there was a declaration of the launch of the Osaka truck, and 86 member states, including the United States, the EU, and China, has been engaged in negotiations of international rulemaking on electric commerce, including free data flow at WTO, which Japan has been leading as a co-convener along with Australia and Singapore. There are different venues that we have been working on. We attach much importance to the role to be played by the OECD. There has been discussions on the review of the privacy guidelines that has been actively promoted among the member states, given the new risks on personal information, such as issues on government access, in addition to the discussions on protecting data security. Japan has been actively addressing the issue of digital trade in various FTAs that we have been concluding, including TPP, both TPP 12 and CPTPP, TPP 11. We also try to include many of the provisions under Japan-EU EPA. Of course, EU has its own privacy policy, GDPR, and there are issues, that we agreed to review after some years, including issues like data free flow or the data localization related matters. Of course, we have, between the United States and Japan, we have agreed on the Japan-US digital trade agreement, which entered into force in January last year. And from the Japanese viewpoint, this is a model agreement as related to digital trade. And in the context of Japan-UK EPA negotiation, basically we have agreed around the same level of digital trade agreements with the UK, which is encouraging development from our viewpoints. So, and especially with in terms of Japan-UK EPA negotiation under the COVID-19, we are obliged to engage in text negotiation, based on online, methods, and but to our delight, we could succeed in concluding negotiation a little over 3 months, and this is a strength of digital negotiation, which is a new mode of negotiation, diplomatic negotiation under COVID-19. Of course, Prime Minister Suga has been attaching much importance to the issue of both digital and net zero emission by 2050. And in terms of digital area, he has proposed establishing a new digital agency. And this is very closely related to Japanese engagement in the international rulemaking in the area of digital trade. And so we wish to continue to engage with like-minded countries which values democracy, human rights, among others. And we wish to cope with possible rise of digital protectionism. Under the COVID-19, we need to be mindful of the temptation to go for protectionism, and we need to attach much importance to principles like transparency and fair and mutually beneficial international rules. So we are hoping with the incoming Biden administration, there will be a new window of opportunity for collaboration. And we are very much encouraged to hear that the UK is focusing on these issues. When International Trade Secretary Liz Truss visited Japan in October to sign Japan-UK EPA, she was talking about establishing a trade track, which I assume would include, a very strong element of digital trade. So I concur with Ewen that UK's presidency on G7 and focus on digital trade and international rulemaking will be instrumental in making further progress in generating new international standards on digital trade. So we are very much looking forward to collaborating with UK on G7 related matters, as well as the United States and the OECD. So I really look forward to engaging in the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Shikata-san. Really terrific compliment to Ewen's presentation as well, to give a sense of Japan's priorities in this important area. And we really welcome that that perspective as well. I should have said, and I was remiss not to say at the beginning, the this event and this series that we've been doing with private roundtables and so forth has been made possible by support from the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and we very much appreciate that. Also, Refinitiv, who is the company for which our next guest works, also has been very supportive of our work in the CSIS Economics Program, and we really appreciate that as well. So without this support, we couldn't have these kinds of conversations, so we're very grateful. So with that, let me turn to our third speaker, Sherry Madera. Sherry is Chief Industry and Government Affairs Officer at Refinitiv. Refinitiv, if you don't know, but you should, is a data company. It's a company that provides information and technology for financial markets, and a really important player in this story. So I'm really looking forward. Sherry's also had experience working at the City of London, the Corporation of London, I assume, there, and also as a Minister, Counsel, and Director at the British Embassy in Beijing. So she's got some interesting Asia experience as well. So with that, let me turn to Sherry.
Well, Matthew, thank you very much for that. And it's always difficult to follow such great panelists, but perhaps I'm here to add a bit of an industry angle to some of this as well. And you're right, Refinitiv is a data company. We work in 190 countries around the world. Some who may not be familiar with the name Refinitiv may know us as previously the financial and risk business of Thomson Reuters. So certainly, it's a business that's been going for about 160 years, but the name is still only 2 years old. And so it changes. And so things change in our world so quickly. And I just wanted to put this into perspective when we talk about data. The IDC did a report, and it predicted that, well, from a standing point of 33 zettabytes of information being generated in 2018, the likelihood is that we're getting to 175 zettabytes of data being generated in 2025 per year. This means nothing unless you start thinking that actually 1 zettabyte, not 175, just one, is about equal to all the sand on all the beaches in the entire world. And that's the new data that's being generated every year. So, it is very, very relevant in terms of what we're going to be doing in terms of commercial activity, in terms of collaboration, in terms of pushing things forward, both on a personal and social level, but also, of course, with business. And it's important for us to think about what are we talking about when we talk about data. Data can be personal data, it can be business data, it can be financial data. At Refinitiv, we also deal with real-time data. We deal with infrastructure data, something we've collaborated with CSIS on in the past as well. Machine-generated data, of course, healthcare data, very important in the COVID age as we're working our way through. But increasingly important, an area we're seeing a lot of demand from, which I'm personally delighted that that's the case, is ESG sustainability data, thinking about what data we can use to make good, sensible financial decisions to channel capital into sustainability. So when we're talking about what do we do with data, how do we manage data, we have to be pretty specific about what data we're talking about, because there is quite a bit of different rules and standards that apply depending on what data we're talking about. Also, there are different perceptions culturally around the world, and we know this very well, having worked so many different jurisdictions around the world. Thinking about who owns data. What about data sovereignty? There's a fundamental difference in terms of what culturally different governments, regions, countries, companies, people feel about who is it that actually owns that data and what can be done with it. And I don't think we should forget that as we continue to navigate the path through how it is we can create a overall global understanding of how data moves and how data can be used. So what about that? What about the rules and the standards? And I think that there are a few buckets that we talk about quite frequently. Data privacy, I think that GDPR kicked everyone into touch in terms of thinking about how to deal with that type of data, and that very much is personal data that's being governed there. But data privacy laws are proliferated around the world, and there are many, many different versions. Some are the same, some are different. And obviously there's been a lot of change recently in terms of what that legislation means about crossing borders. So the privacy shield that was in place between the US and many countries has now changed and been legislated against. There's various different areas that this is impacting, but the clarity is certainly still being developed as to what does that mean in terms of how is it that data can be transferred and where the rules and regulations fall. So it is something to be aware of, that this is very much an active and moving topic globally. But privacy data and data privacy is not the only type of data. We talk about data localization, and that can not only include privacy and personal data, but also some business data, and indeed data that's being derived from within the borders of a certain country. The question is, the benefits of that data. Is that actually should that be the benefit of the people in that country? Should it be the benefit of the companies that have been generating that data there? Is it a global good? Is it a personal good? Again, these are very, very high level issues, but certainly manifest themselves in thinking about how data is governed. And of course, there's also the question as we move into things like economic and environmental, social, and governance data, which is which data needs to be disclosed. And of course, I would say this as Refinitiv, a financial data player, the disclosures are important. And some might say, well, that means it's an issuer. So someone who's providing a company that's wanting to issue a security, either equity or debt or derivative or something, they need to disclose a certain amount of data. But actually data disclosures for the good of, for example, climate change impacts may also need to come from governments. They may need to come from localities, they may need to come from people, depending on what it is we're trying to achieve. So again, I'm creating more questions than answers here, but perhaps I can give just two very brief examples of where we see data legislation crossing borders being important. The first one is fighting financial crime. So if we think about sort of privacy data and we think about sharing that very widely, I think most individuals worldwide have certain amounts of limitations. And so therefore, a data privacy law would be something that would be generally upheld. However, if you think about it through a lens of trying to fight financial crime, it's really essential for data on individuals, on where money is flowing from and to be disclosed across borders securely, in order for that data to be used to prevent fraud. In fact, there's some damning evidence that says only 1% of global financial fraud and financial crime is being caught right now. And part of that is because data can't be shared in a way that's secure and that is understood across borders. You can imagine if you can't share data, you're actually harboring the potential for financial criminals to locate in your jurisdiction. And moreover, more practically, more commercially, banks and institutions, if they can't actually share data even within their own networks, it's very difficult for them to start opening up bank accounts or simple ways of being able to provide financial inclusion, to provide support for businesses, all of this being really important in a post-COVID environment where everyone is seeking growth and trying to be able to be as efficient as possible digitally about how to make money work efficiently and effectively. So security and sharing of data really is absolutely linked to fighting financial crime and the anti-money laundering legislations out there. I mentioned before sustainability, and I'm also the chair of the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, so it's something that's near and dear to my heart. The fact is that there are many taxonomies and data structures and frameworks being spun up around the world, but they're all slightly different. And from my point of view, and from the Alliance's point of view, trying to make sure we have a definition of data that underpins these taxonomies and these regulations are going to be fundamental to making sure that we actually have a globally harmonious understanding of how it is we're trying to tackle climate change, make sure that the recovery that Helwyn talked about is truly building back better, thinking about a just and right recovery as well as an economic recovery. So I think that there are a lot of questions out there, but if we can focus on trying to understand how it is the G7 can add value to this, take that data free flow with trust concept and make sure that it actually is globally applicable. Because the fact of the matter is that a lot of the time, especially in financial services, a lot of the data is being housed in emerging markets. And so the concept of data localization, the implementation of data privacy, the thinking about how data can and cannot move across borders becomes quite impactful to the financial markets, who are seen as hopefully an engine for positive growth going forward as we move into a post-COVID era. So I think I've said plenty on that one, more questions than answers.
Okay, but terrific, really put some other issues on the table, and we're actually getting questions that are kind of touching on some of the topics that you raised. So I'm going to try and start folding those in. But first, we have a surprise and a pleasant surprise to join us here on screen, I hope, now or soon. Andy Wickoff, who is Director for Science, Technology, and Innovation at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, which, by the way, happy birthday. I think it's the 60th anniversary. If it isn't today, I think it's
well done.
It's this week, right? So the OECD is this, critical but underappreciated organization in Paris that works on global norms and standards and best practices. And Andy has been there for a long time and is in charge of, really, he is the world's kind of leading guru in a way on data governance. He's been working on this for many years, and I think he's going to tell us that this is an increasing priority for the OECD. So Andy, if you'd be willing to offer us, a few minutes of your thoughts and what you're working on and how you see these issues, we'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt, and thank to CIS for the opportunity to chime in here. I am in violent agreement with everything that's being said. So just quickly, I just want to say that for those of you who don't know, that the OECD does offer its support to both G7 and G20 presidencies. They are the political leaders. We are just the secretariat, but we've had some success in, as Ewen mentioned, the G7. I take it back to Takamatsu in 2016, where they started the conversation about AI ethics. It went forward to Milan, and then to Charlevoix in Canada, and then last year in Biarritz, as she said, the Global Partnership on AI, which is really a concrete manifestation of those early ideas, and Takamatsu came forward. And it's just got launched a week or so ago. But I find it to be promising, particularly in an era when so many begin to question multilateralism. Here's a new tool coming available, and I think hopefully it will grow. I just want to talk about two developments at the OECD that I think are relevant for the conversation. The first is just before our 60th birthday, and you're right, Matt, it's today. But even though we're in France, we're not going to retire yet. I just want to say that. But last Friday, our program and working budget for 21-22 was approved by the membership. And as part of this package, we will have what we call a horizontal project, a project that involves many different parts of the OECD looking at data governance. And this will be the focus for 21-22, involving 10 different directorates, from tax to trade to employment to the governance directorate, led by science, technology, and innovation. This project is designed around 4 different modules. The first is, and it's been very much the discussion today, access, control, and sharing of data. The second module, really inspired by the Japanese and others, will be on cross-border data flows. The third will be on business model, market dynamics, and market structure. How does data change the way businesses operate and markets operate? And last, as Sherry just has touched on, and I'm so happy to hear it, about measurement and about how we have to stop talking about data as this monolithic entity, but rather very different elements and with different definitions, different taxonomies. And I think with that comes some answers, hopefully, to making progress. Now, while this may seem like a very comprehensive view, as I've said before, and I'm happy to hear Ewen say the same thing, I think to make progress we need to put individual pieces of the puzzle down on the table, and hopefully through that begin to see the bigger picture for how to resolve some of these issues. And with that, I just want to end by filling in a little bit. He was politely discreet, but DG Shikata was referring to a meeting we held a week or two ago on our privacy guidelines and their periodic revision, which we do. And somewhat surprisingly, but very gratifyingly, as we talked about this, and particularly the issue of trusted government access to private data held by private companies. okay, which has been a sticking point on some cross-border data flows. And thanks to the table, people began to realize, as Ewen was saying, there's much more that we agree on than what we tend to focus on that's negative. And can we begin to build on those positive elements to begin to see a step forward on this? And I'm hopeful for a public statement at the end of this week, early in the new year. But to me, this is an important piece of the puzzle that if we're able to resolve, I think will be a good building base for moving forward. And again, I would just say, as someone who's spent a lot of his career at a multilateral organization, I'm happy to see a multilateral organization being able to pull together like-minded countries to begin to resolve this issue. So with that, again, let me thank you, and we look forward to serving both the G20 and the G7 presidencies in 21.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. Really terrific. And I like the optimism there, a point, which is so important, building on what we can agree on. And let me, I'm gonna start winding in audience questions already. We've got some good ones, but welcome more if you have them. Let me first, though, ask my own question really to the group, but I'll start with Shikata-san. This word trust keeps coming up. It's in Data Free Flow with Trust. I think Ewen mentioned it. Sherry implied it if she didn't actually say it. But it's not exactly clear to me. I think I know trust when I see it, but I'm not exactly sure what it means in this context. Who's trusting whom in what ways? Are we talking about individuals trusting companies, trusting their government, governments trusting businesses, or vice versa? And what exactly does it mean, and how do we flesh that out? Shikata-san, can you give us some thoughts on that, please?
Sure. Of course, trust is such a big concept. That there is a lot of room for interpretation, and the typical issue that arises is when there's like big data platformer entering one country. Can you trust the company? And whether the privacy or individual data could be abused. And that could also happen in the context of diplomatic relations, whether country A and country B could trust each other. And if they are willing to exchange the data. And we have already seen some of those issues in reality when the big data company or social media company from one country may be refused, based on this issue of trust. So I think there are different dimensions of the word trust, but that I think that based on this discussion, there is much room, for us to develop new international rules according to different levels and definitions of trust. There is a room for expanding our discussion to agree on the new areas of international rules. So I guess we are at this juncture of, for example, in Geneva, to try to consolidate the text of e-commerce. There are lots of brackets, but still we have seen some progress. And from our viewpoint, this is a progress of concept of DFFT. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I don't know whether I should have mentioned that there's a good question in this regard from Sarah Bowerly-Dansman about the relationship between balancing internet freedom issues with national security concerns around sensitive personal data. So how are the UK and Japan thinking about this in sort of a national security context? I don't know, Ewen, whether you want to give us some more thoughts elaborating on your point about trust and how your government sees that.
Sure, happy to touch on that briefly. As I said, I think when I mentioned trust there, I was referring to the relationship between our populations and government, and our populations and the companies with which they interact every day. We're keen to make sure that people trust that governments are both using the data that they're given well and not kind of overstepping that mark on privacy, and similarly that the conversations governments are having with the companies that operate within their borders and making sure that people's data is kept safe. However, I think the key point is what Sherry touched on. It's about the categorization of this data. It's about making sure we understand when we're talking about different types of data, we understand the difference between personal data and manufacturing data or infrastructure data or whatever else it might be. And we believe that there are ways of making sure that you can still mine the useful elements of data so that it can inform national security conversations or illicit finance operations, as Sherry was alluding to, without compromising that privacy. So it's about using clever tools of categorization, of aggregate data, anonymizing it to make sure it can be used properly. But it's incredibly complex, and that fundamental basis of people trusting that government is using their data well and won't overstep the mark is really important. I mean, it's an age-old debate in our country. Every time you hear about new spy laws, people get incredibly concerned, and rightly so. I think if that trust is broken and the legitimacy of government's right to use that data is broken, you get into real trouble. So it's important that we keep that conversation open and maintain that trust with our populations.
Okay, let me ask the question to Sherry this way, and then I'm going to add a second question to Sherry, which is a little different, but just to get that going. But let me just say, I mean, there is this element of suspicion or concern among ordinary citizens about how companies are using their data. Is that something that's a legitimate, feels like as a citizen myself with my own data concerns, that seems like a legitimate concern, but is that something that one can address in a way that gives people that sort of sense of confidence and trust, and also enables then data to flow? Because again, as a citizen, I also want data to flow. I don't want it to be bottled up or owned by any particular entity. So I see the value of that. How do you balance all of that? I guess I won't ask my second question. I'll come back to that, but go ahead, Sherry.
All right, thanks, Matthew. You give me the hard ones, don't you? But the reality is actually there's quite a lot of legislation already out there that a company who holds data must adhere to. They're already, it's not like companies get to make it up for themselves. So I do think that there's already a good framework out there. I think that a lot of the work that needs to be done going from here is to try and find a way of harmonizing or mapping those good efforts onto each other so that that cross-border element can come into play most fruitfully. However, one thing we haven't mentioned here that actually might play to your point, Matthew, about being nervous about who holds the data is the cyber element of this. And the cybersecurity element and the resilience piece. I think we've all used the word resilience more times than we can count over the course of the last year. But it comes into play really here when you start thinking about what are the obligations, not only about how you hold and what data you hold and how you disclose and how you use data, but also how you protect it. And it's not just about locking a filing cabinet anymore. It's very sophisticated, and oftentimes, companies or governments or entities don't even know when data has been accessed. So the levels of sophistication on that front need to go up. I think everybody is aware of that. But again, there are legislations coming for that too. I refer to the Digital Operational Resilience Act that's being considered out of the EU as well. And that brings in sort of big data providers and data vendors into sort of how is it that they are going to comply with very high standards of data security.
Let me just keep with you and ask you, Sherry, both you and Andy Wyckoff mentioned some specific areas that are important in this conversation of, access and control of data, data flow, data measurement. What do you think, or what do you think would be a realistic objective for a group like the G7 to get done in this coming year? they're not going to solve all of that or come up with a common approach even among the seven, let alone a global answer. But what do you think would be a useful, meaningful thing for them to do? If you imagine that summer summit that Ewen talked about, when they come out of that, you know, if they said X or Y, you know, what would be useful to take this debate forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I hasten to add that G7 has a lot on its plate these days. But actually, I think it comes back to the basics. You know, this explosion of data has taken sort of a while to get to this point. And now it becomes the data is on everyone's lips. But what, you know, the definition of that data, I think, is critical. So if the G7 could find a very clear framework of mapping what data sets and what data you're talking about moving from where to where. So data from point A to point B, what's being done to that data and where it's being shared at point B and how it moves forward. A map that understands what data are you talking about legislating? What data are you talking about? What do these regulations apply to? You know, I think that it is difficult as soon as you start having a global data-centric entity to make sure that you understand sort of what data are we speaking about. So those bottom basic bricks of defining what a data set is and what is being governed, I think seems like we're going back, but I think we need to do that before we can go forward.
Okay, I don't know whether, you know, Shikata-san or Ewen have anything to add on that. Shikata-san?
Well, let me just, you know, point out, you know, that getting back to your original, you know, question, I was trying to think what kind of elements that we need to discuss in terms of trust elements, which include probably privacy, data protection, intellectual property right protection, and as was mentioned, you know, cybersecurity related security elements. So we need to construct international legal framework when we see different levels of protection according to different countries. And this is a challenge when we, for example, when we are discussing between Japan and the EU on EPA digital, you know, chapter, we may, you know, have a different concepts, approaches in individual data privacy issues. So as was mentioned, you know, how we harmonize our domestic regulations to form international agreements, I think is a key.
Okay, we have again a bunch of questions. Let me try and blend two questions that are kind of related, at least in my mind. One is from Kartik Ashta, who asks about how you can develop international standards when the two most populous countries in the world, India and China, don't ascribe to such a concept of international rules in this area, and emerging nations don't even have access to the sort of technology and IP that is being discussed. That's one question. And then I think of it as a related question. Yancey Molnar of Chubb asks, COVID-19 has exposed the fact the ability to do business digitally is essential. It's a must-have, not a nice to do. Given that there's the growing recognition around that around the world, are we more optimistic about the possibility of progress in this area, or are we kind of condemned to 3 or 4 different worlds where you have a sort of a Western G7 world, maybe even that one split between the US and EU because we have a lot of differences, a China approach to these issues, and maybe a rest of the world approach. How do people see that sort of that problem? Because the G7's only 7, well, it's actually 31 countries, I think I counted recently, if you count the EU seat that represents 27 minus the 3 that have their own seat. But still, it's not the whole world. So how do you pull all those different strands together? I mean, Ewen, I don't know whether you want to start or if you got this on or.
Yeah, I was going to say, I found that an interesting question and happy to come back on that. I mean, look, I think we have to be realistic. You're never going to be able to start with an agreement amongst 193 countries that signed tomorrow. That's not going to happen. I think, as I said at the beginning, I think it's about growing a critical mass of countries that see the benefits of this, both in security terms and prosperity terms, of having that reduction in barriers to trade, that reduction in barriers to business operability by having this free flow of data between them. I would love for that to start with the 7, as hard as that is. And I think Sherry's point about the definition is an important baseline. And then I think one thing we're really keen to do is that mapping of the different regulations we have around digital competition in one area, digital trade in another area, and how we can start to firstly map it, then understand what the differences are and how important they are to us, and whether we can harmonize those to create a bit, just a smoother business working environment for companies within the G7. But I would hope that if we can make the case at 7 plus guests and anyone else that wants to join us, that this works, that there is huge kind of economic growth benefits to doing this, then we can bring others with us and you gradually build up the case. And I think to the first part of the question about has COVID made this more likely to happen, I think absolutely yes. I mean, I don't know if others were aware, but there was a Google outage just half an hour before we started this call. And as I was saying to others, Cabinet Office IT is based on Google Mail and Google Docs. So it's just gone right to the top of our risk register, making sure we've got backups for that, because there's nothing like a burning platform to make people absolutely get on and fix these things. So I personally am more optimistic. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And we may start with 3 different systems, but I would hope that the economic case will be made, and the security case, as Sherry was pointing out, that in order for these systems to ultimately be effective, you have to keep growing that group that has a shared approach to these issues. Over.
Sherry or Shikata-san, do you want to?
Yes, okay. Yes,
Shikata-san.
if I may, I wish to just give an example of recently signed RCEP. And as you may be aware,
economic partnership, the big Asian trade deal. Yep, go ahead.
Exactly. So initially we were negotiating among ASEAN plus 6, ASEAN plus Japan, China, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And India dropped out of the negotiation last year. But when we signed RCEP agreements among 15 countries, including China, as of mid-November, there is an e-commerce chapter, and there is inclusion of such elements as protection of consumers, or protection of individual information, or no tax on digital flow, or data free flow, and prohibition of requirements to have computer facilities. So, of course, it's not TPP, and there is no immediate application of dispute settlement. But in our view, this is a step forward in introducing these kind of principles, not only to China, but also to other less developed countries, such as Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. So there are different venues, that we can engage. And of course, it is ideal if we could come up with agreement among WTO members. We are negotiating among 80 countries, about half of WTO members. And we are already seeing, it's very challenging to arrive at the final agreement on the consolidated text.
And China is in both the WTO negotiations and in RCEP, so that's part of an answer to the first questioner's question. India could have been in RCEP and maybe will be again, and actually leads to, just let me pivot to you, Sherry, by saying, because you've worked in Asia a lot, as Shikata-san suggested, there is some foundational work going on in that region. So you have RCEP, you have the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership or its successor agreement that has some digital disciplines. You have the USMCA, actually the Mexico-Canada agreement, which is a Pacific a deal, has some good digital disciplines in it as well. US-Japan have a bilateral. APEC has done a lot of work on cross-border privacy rules. So there feel like there are a lot of the pieces of the puzzle or things going on in the region that maybe could be built upon. Do you think that there's a way of getting to a kind of common approach, or at least a more mutually accepted approach through Asia and through that work.
Yeah, I'm so glad that RCEP was brought up, because I do think it's a platform that we need to look at for this. I mean, for trade deals traditionally have been about product. And the reality is, you know, our world is moving swiftly to services, and this entire conversation is about a service or an intangible data. So I think that these constructs, you know, should be used to leverage those conversations. But, you know, I'm going to be slightly controversial here, which says that if the G7 is working together to find a commonality, you know, I very much support that. However, from an industry perspective, quite a lot of the data that is actually being moved around, that's being utilized for customer support, for user centers, for development, for thinking about sort of innovation, et cetera, it's happening in India, it's happening in China, it's happening in the Philippines, it's happening in other parts of Asia. So at least sort of bringing in those entities early is going to be actually very beneficial for business. Because actually that, you know, those barriers and those borders that are being crossed are fundamental to decision making that's in the tens of millions, in the billions of dollars of cost overall for an industry, and particularly in the economic headwinds we're heading into over the course of the next few years, really understanding what impacts that will have on business if those countries are not going to have a commonality of purpose for data is significant. So bring them in early.
Okay, terrific. You know, we've got so many other good questions, but Ewen, would you like to follow up on that, or have any further questions? Okay, because I do see we're out of time. There's a question here that kind of from I think Robbie Feldman, or Robert Feldman, I assume it's Robbie, our old friend in Tokyo, about enforcement against violations of data security or breaches, and who's going to enforce that, which leads in my mind to something about, you know, there's no WTO, there's no, you know, single global force that is going to enforce any of this. Should there be, you know, should there be some kind of organization, or at least a network of regulators, data regulators, who come together through something. Someone has suggested the idea of a financial stability board-like body, a G20 designated group of regulators who would come together to, you know, share information, monitor developments, develop best practices, and so forth, without actually being a regulatory body themselves. So lots of food for thought there, which I wish we could explore further. But unfortunately, unless anyone has any final, Shigata-san, you'd like to say something finally, and then we'll end.
On Robert Feldman, Feldman's question, when we look at some of FTAs, EPAs in recent years, there are dispute settlement chapter, such as in TPP, TPP-11, Japan-EU, and Japan-UK. So if we could include, you know, dispute settlement chapter, there is venue for settling, you know, some of disagreements or violations according to the agreements, you know, we could reach. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, look, there's so much more to talk about here. Unfortunately, in this format, it's difficult to have a conversation that goes much longer on one setting, but we'll do this again. This is obviously an issue that we're going to continue to be interested in, and all of the people on this call I know are interested and involved. But at this point, we're going to have to end. So let me just thank all of our speakers: Ewen Philpott from the UK, Noriyuki Shikata from Tokyo, and Sherry Madeira from Refinitiv. Thank you so much. Andy Wyckoff as well from the OECD for his intervention as well, which is very helpful. We're going to be following the OECD work very closely as well. And with that, let me thank all of the audience as well for joining, especially people in Europe who stayed up late. I mean, in Asia and in Europe, took time. So thank you so much, and we will see you again. Take care.